Everybody, I'm supposed to speak a little on Brazil. I see finally my Polish friends are here. Thank you. Let me try to comment on this, how it looks from Brazil, and give some key arguments. This is better? Yes. Brazil is, as you know, looking for new ways. We've elected Lula in 2003, which was a huge struggle. We are among the most unequal countries, at least in the 10 most unequal countries in the world. Having hunger in Mali, for example, is in a way understandable. Having hunger in Brazil, which has the greatest reserve of idle land, agricultural land in the world, is really it's understandable, but it's institutional, and it is a political problem, of course. Basically, let's say the fact that we made it work, in my opinion, is that we help the poor and at the same time the rich. And the poor at a slightly more accelerated rhythm than the rich. Because if we made a drastically poor-oriented and environment-oriented policy, it would just not hold politically. So the political element in the equation is central. We've had military dictatorships in Brazil, like we've had them in Chile and Argentina and so many, and now we've had a coup by the big economic groups in Paraguay. We've had the changes in Chile, we've had the coup in Honduras. So we have a kind of a very curious democracy where you are allowed to have democracy if you don't use it. If you use it, you stop to have the democracy. So the idea is to have a democracy, but keep the privileges of a typically non-democratic state. So you have political democracy, in which you have the elections, you put your vote every 2 or 4 years. But you don't use this democracy to democratize the social, economic, and cultural policies in the country. And so this is the central, let's say, of the discussion. Let me give a rough overview of these policies. We started in 2003 with a bureaucratic task, which was very hard. We have in this country of roughly 190 million inhabitants, we had 1/3 of the population, roughly 60-some million people, who had no postal address, no identity card, no bank account, obviously. They didn't exist. I say this quite peacefully because I participated in the Fernando Henrique Cardoso's, not in his government, and was not paid, let's say, by the issues, but Fernando Henrique's wife tried to make social policies in the 90s Ruth Cardozo was a very serious person. Fernanda Henrique Cardozo much less so. She was very, very competent. And we tried to make policies, social policies, in we call the Conseil de la Comunidad Solidaria, Solidaria Community. It just didn't work because we had no access. We had slices of ministerial, let's say, social policies. Every ministry has to have some poor they are taken care of. But they were not serious policies. So what starts actually in 2003 is a statewide, government-wide policy to include the poor populations. We had to make a huge effort to know who the poor are, because they were not identified. It's an enormous bureaucratic task. So we had to rely on the religious movements, NGOs, social organizations of the most different parts, because quite obviously we are in Brazil, and as in so many countries, if you relied on the local mayor, you would frequently have his wife and in-laws, etc., in the list of the poor who needed support. I'm not cynical about this. There are very good mayors, but overall, it took us 2 years to make a decent cadastre of who are the poor, and this was essential so that we can transfer resources to them, and at the time control the presence of children in school and the whole presence of children and the families in the health system. So it obliged us to organize in the 565 municipalities of the countries, organized, let's say, local information on the key poverty issues. And I would remind you that when we speak of sustainability, we are not speaking only of the green issue, we're speaking of the social issue. And the social dimension of sustainability in Brazil is central to sustainability overall, because when you have this kind of poverty in this country, this is clearly the priority. We managed to draw up this list of roughly 60 million people, and we used a very practical system, which had been thought of by Ruth Cardozo, by the way, which is giving a credit card to every poor family. It's not intuitive to make this a top of technology for the bottom of the pyramid, but it worked. Among others, because we gave this credit card loaded with so much money every month, and this allows the federal government to directly transfer the money to the poor. Where you don't have a bank, you make an agreement with a local commerce or something, and you have access to this money. So we managed to overcome a tendency of money to evaporate when you transfer it. So if we if we had gone normally through the state administration, from federal government money to state money to municipality and to the poor, we know that through a curious, volatile quality of money, very little would have come to the poor. So the money goes directly, central government to the person. It's one of these interesting possibilities of these new technologies. And very important, the money did not go to the so-called chiefs of the family. It went to the real chiefs of the family, which are the women. So the mothers received the money. For some mysterious reason, women use the money more decently than men do, apparently. This had a huge influence on the quality of the use of the money, which, as we were discussing here, I think is always a key issue. Who receives and how the things are appropriated, the projects, the supports, and giving it to the women, and particularly to women with children and no husband, which is roughly 28. Thank you. Which is roughly 28% of the families in Brazil. It's not news that families are getting apart. In the United States, only 25% of households you have daddy, mommy, and the kids. The image that we've been sold and oversold in every film, where you have the two nice little blonde kids and papa and mama and the dog and the apple pie, forget it. This is not the reality anymore. So, as you do not have the family as a system of support, you need the social policy as a system of support, and much more of it, and not much less of it, as some people have been pushing. So this is one project. It's called Bolsa Familia now, to support. And the great war was that the right told us that these people, these poor, if you give them money, they would just lean on the money and do nothing. What happened is exactly the contrary. They were stimulated. And in fact, not only they were stimulated, but they were, they don't play on the commodity prices and the future markets and so forth. They buy the commodities. I mean, they buy rice, they buy beans, they buy things. They buy what we call the salary goods, which can expand very rapidly, because this local demand in small places, in very poor places, we have hugely poor places, particularly in the northeast, but also in the peripheries of the big cities. And this leads immediately to a stimulation of small-scale production. And this led to more jobs and small-scale investment. And let's say, in a way, it is a seed money in the sense that it stimulates a lot of other activities, which stimulates jobs, which stimulates more salaries, which stimulates more demand, and you gradually set into movement a kind of a virtuous circle of productive inclusion. So we go gradually from distributive inclusion to productive inclusion. Let me say that this went along with a set of policies. Everybody knows about the Bolsa Familia, it's in the papers internationally, but there are actually 149 nationwide social programs. It is a nationwide policy of inclusion. One of the main elements was basic salaries, minimum salary policy, which increased in real terms by more than 50% in the Lula period, and it is increasing still. This is a huge difference for the poorer part of the population. It changes the situation of roughly 26 million workers, and since when you raise the minimum salary, the retirement levels, pension levels, are also indexed on this, it raised the incomes of 18 million retired people. So if you put together the Bolsa Familia, 50 million, you put 18 million pension, you put 26 million minimum salary, things start to add up. So gradually you are creating a new market within Brazil, and Brazil starts to understand that it's not necessarily export-led development that will make things work, but the internal market, or let's say that the drama which is poverty and unemployment can be transformed into an opportunity because you have an economic horizon to expand within the country. So when the crisis, the world crisis in 2008 hit Brazil, we had already dozens and dozens of social programs of inclusion. And this set a dynamics which is very interesting because there was a crisis of export. So for example, the meat industry, which was used to export meat to Europe, for example, and could not export anymore because of the crisis, they lowered their prices and they started selling more on internal market. So they had opposed so much this, what they called demagogical policy of helping the poor, and they found it interesting because they had an internal market. They had how to reroute themselves, reorganize from external market to internal market. So the fact that we had several years of social policies and the huge organizational infrastructure this needed, at the moment the crisis hits Brazil, it meant that we had a much stronger position. We had, of course, among these policies, very strong social infrastructure policies, education, health, etc. In the social infrastructures will include assainissement, how do you call assainissement? It's sewage systems of the kind, yes. Sewage, yeah. We have access to water, we had access to electricity. We connected with electricity 8 million households which had no access to electricity. You imagine the possibility of a kid studying at home at night, having a light, of being able to put medicine in a fridge and things of the kind. It's a huge advance in this 149 projects that I mentioned. It's really interesting. You can go to the MDS website, mds.gov, government.br is Brazil, and you have the different reports. There are reports, and you can follow up. I think understanding this overall plan of inclusion, it can, in my view, certainly be a blueprint for so many national policies worldwide. As I said, when the crisis hit Brazil, immediately Brazilian banks starting, the bankers become very desperate in the presence of a crisis. Unfortunately, they do not jump anymore, as in 1929, but they shouted very loudly. So the government, you start panicking a little, that started transferring money to the banks as was being done in the United States and in Europe. But we very quickly saw that the 90 billion reais, which is roughly half of this is in dollars, that we were transferring to the banks, they were not using this to stimulate the economy and to finance development. They were using this to buy government bonds and it's very interesting because you give public money to the bankers, and they buy public bonds, which pay very well. At the time, they were paying roughly 13%. And you earn private money on public money, which comes obviously from our pockets. So they like this. What the Lula government did immediately was pulling the money back and started identifying which were the sectors of the economy effectively critically hit by the international crisis. Several sectors of industry and agriculture. And they reoriented the support directly to producers. Now, as we had at the same time the stimulation of the economy, because we are including in the demand process and the consumption process a huge mass of population, and we were giving financial support for these areas these sectors were able to maintain the production, and they had the internal consumption capacity. And we lowered the taxes on these products so the poorer people could buy. And we made, through the federal national banks, public banks, we made very low interest credit for consumption of this product. So this generated an economic dynamic that protected Brazil from the crisis, and at the same time was solving the social problem of exclusion, because these people needed this basic consumption, access to food, access to refrigerator, access to basic, let's say, household goods. So these things work together. So on the one hand, I have all this set of social policies, and social policies have immediate impact on the what we call more green economy, yes, because we set up a movement. We have roughly 7 million people living in human households. So we're building, it's called Minha Casa Minha Vida, my house, my life, and we're building over 1 million houses now, and this stimulates, of course, the economy, and this introduces sewage, and this is very green. I mean, this is a dimension of sustainability that puts together the green and the social issues and stimulates the economy. More recently, this kind of stimulation packages, we've been conditioning them more and more. So, for example, the very recent support for automobile industry is conditioned to much better technological solutions in terms of dioxide emission and things of the kind. So actually, what we see is a transition to a government which is, in a certain kind, watching what are the weaker parts of the economy and taking from one place to the other, you see. All this has costs. But actually, as we stimulated the economy, when you stimulate the economy, you have more taxes. And we have more taxes, you cover what you've been spending on the social policies and the green policies and so forth, because it stimulates the whole economic machine. Whereas, without giving special counsel to anyone, but in my opinion, when you make austerity, you stop the economy, and you stop the economy, and when you stop the economy, you have less taxes, and when you have less taxes, and you give away money to the banks, of course, you have a problem, because you have more public money going to the banks. And curiously, you are surely aware that what the European Central Bank has been giving to the banks at 1% a year in huge amounts is ending up in Brazil, among others, because they put it in Brazilian public bonds. They pay 7.5%. They take it here at 1%. They don't produce anything. 7.5 minus 1 is 6.5. This is quite interesting. So we've been obliged, for the first time, we're not begging for foreign money. We've put a tax of 2%, then 4%, and now 6% on money that is entering the country. Overall, let's say it's social policy, green policy, and macroeconomics put together in an integrated view of how we may manage the economy, the social and different issues. Let me say that on the green aspect of all this, there is, of course, the major problem of the Amazon forest. The Amazon was being destroyed at a rate of 28,000 square kilometers in 2002. We are presently at 6,000 square kilometers destroyed. This is a huge victory. It continues a disaster, of course, but it is a huge victory, because it's not someone is cutting down the wood in the Amazon. It's a system. And I would like to link it very much to Brian's discussion yesterday, because it's not, you had a very good term on this, how you, decision-making environment, you called it. Actually, this decision-making environment in these situations does not belong to the producer. Yes, it works like this. You cut down the wood. If you take a mahogany tree, they pay roughly $15 to the guy who cuts it down. But when you put it on the market in France, it's worth roughly $5,000 brutto. Yes. So actually this technologically, it's so much cheaper to take the wood down. You know, you don't need axes anymore. So it goes very, very quickly. So the technology helps, and as the very precious wood, the prices are going up, the profits become enormous. So it's very hard to hold back this whole system. So they take the wood down, it's interesting for them, and it export. Yes. And then you burn what remains there, and it's very bad, it's carbon dioxide. Yes. But it brings potash into the land, and it makes 3 or 4 very, very profitable years of soya production. And you export the grain. And you have very weak, the Amazon soil is very weak. And you don't have the forest cover anymore. You have very strong rains, so you wash the land out. So the only use you can have for this is for cattle, roughly 4 hectares per head. Yes. So it's a loss of land in a way. And in this, the producer has very small decision capacity. And what we managed to do in the reduction of the destruction of the forest was not running after these guys who cut down the forest. We made meetings in São Paulo with the big international importers, because you have the meat interests, international big groups, soya interests, Chicago Board of Trade, Cargill, Midland, Bunge, Monsanto, and so forth, the wood interests, yes. And so we had to rely on agreements and, let's say, very strong arguments, irrecusáveis, arguments you could not refuse for the big corporations who buy and live on this system. So it's an international system where the individual decision on what is my strategy is very small. They're very linked. To tell you that all this comes together into a huge tension between the whole international system of interests and the much weaker capacity, local government capacity to protect, let's say, the longer term interests. What I am trying to bring about so that we have these 149 projects of social and economic inclusion. And this results in a macroeconomic policy. We've been struggling now to reduce taxes, on the lower part and creating a new tax policy for the richer. We do not have practically a tax on the use of land. It's a ridiculous tax, imposto territorial rural, it is called. And this is very bad, because if we have a good tax on big rural property, these guys either they produce or they have to sell it to someone who will produce, because you generate a cost. So will not be enough to put a few heads of cattle there. See? So we have a series of elements of transformation in the macroeconomic policy that are hampered by the political tensions, because as everywhere, trying to reduce the privileges of those who have the privileges is extremely hard, because there is a coincidence between, obviously, the economic privileges and political strength and media control. So we have these policies, we have the macroeconomic changes and the fact that these social policies are stimulating the economy, so it gives us a balance, it protects us from the international pressures, and it is changing, which is, I think, the third fruit of these policies. It changes the way of governance. Yes. We've been introducing planning in every part of the and it is very democratic. It's based on regional, local, sector conferences. We have hundreds and hundreds of conferences where people can speak up. And this is immensely important, because when you take a decision, after it has been effectively consulted, of course it takes much longer to bring the policy to a decision. But once you take the decision, the things work, because the different stakeholders in this process, they are agreed with this tendency. So instead of deciding a policy and then seeing this policy being dispersed and disrupted by small resistances everywhere, you have a convergence created, and this actually makes the policies work. So we have the national plans we have for water, for sewage, for garbage, for housing, for climate policy, for education, the national broadband plan, access to internet, and so forth. A plan is a democratic instrument, because if you put the 10 years before you on the table, this is what we as a government are intending to do, people can react to this. And especially as it is in Brazil, when all these plans are submitted to a great number, hundreds and hundreds of conferences to put the different stakeholders to agree to this. In a way, it is democratizing the country. We made this year, in May 2012, a transparency law. All the public government decisions, all the accounts are transparent by law. Yes. We're still fighting on access to some information on the military and other informations concerning the dictatorships and the death of so many people. It's not enough to make the law to make things happen, but things are coming along. So planning, transparency, the fact that all these programs are online on the government sites, the fact that we have movements like ethos, which was mentioned here by Elena, which is a movement of roughly 500 corporations that agree to a certain open-minded approach to this kind of civilized, let's say, policy. All this is creating a new dynamics. Not to make it so rosy, let me say that we have huge reactions. We have a very, very strong far right which hates everything. To tell you, when we had the Dilma election, our new president, I received, as everybody received, on our emails, images of Dilma with blood dripping because she was a communist, she was a terrorist, and so forth and so forth. I mean, when you reduce some privileges from the rich, I mean, it's impressive how far people can go to keep their 8-room apartment or whatever things. And actually nobody is threatening this, but I mean, only the fact that you're giving more importance to the poor, apparently it sets ideological forces, wakens them, and it generates a kind of hatred that is very worrisome. I mean, it's not. They control the four major. Practically all the press belongs to four families, and this, when you spread like in Venezuela and other countries, hate every day to the whole populations. 95% of the households have TV. It hurts. So it's difficult. I mean, we're trying to build a new path with internal threats from this right-wing movements, and obviously international threats through the world crisis, which much clearly is setting us on a very unstable situation worldwide. Let me just add one idea concerning this, is that I think it's very important to read the report by the Swiss Federal Institute of Technological Research on the network of global corporate control. For the first time, we have the basic data on how the international financial system works. Basically, we have 147 groups, control 40% of the worldwide system, and 737 control 80% of it. You don't have to have any conspiracy ideas in your head. I mean, when you are 147, you are together in a golf club, and it's not difficult to promote the policies. I mean, this has a huge impact on this imbalance between the real economy and the financial casino. We've all followed the illegalities from UBS, from Barclay, from all of them practically. We are facing huge world instability. Let me mention that we have a world GDP of $63 trillion, and the outstanding derivatives, which is the papers they have emitted on the riches they don't have and they don't produce, are above $600 trillion. This is the real situation, nothing new. You go to the BIS from Basel, the Bank for International Settlements, you put their derivatives, you have the numbers. So we are facing, indeed, we have, let's say, trying to make solid policies in the face of huge international turbulence. I participated in the Rio +20 as an official delegate in the negotiations, and considering that the United States are worried with their elections, and it is very worrying, really. And Europe is worried with the euro, and China is worried with itself, and there was not much space for suddenly everybody being so preoccupied with climate change and so forth. So I see this overall as we are heading with very little overall government's capacities in the face of huge threats. I'm not very optimistic in this part, but quite reasonably hopeful concerning Brazil itself. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this complete overview of Brazilian public policy. And, I'm happy to see there is a revival of planning and a democratic one in Brazil. That's good. So, thank you for all that. Probably there is some question. I see one there. I have just an idea here. You know, the law in physics, and it's not only the bankers, it's everybody in the world, you know, that say, the more you shout or the more you cry, the less you jump. And before. I think it's an hormonal disorder. We have here somebody that works on the field of endocrinology. Obviously, it's a kind of adaptation. And it's good for everybody, but bankers do. Fine, that's all. Some questions?
I found your presentation fascinating.
Thank you.
There is something that I'm not sure that I've understood correctly what you meant, because at the beginning you were insisting on the difference between what's happening at the local level, at the local governance level, and at the national level, where the influence of big business and that kind of thing are much stronger. And I understand that. But at the end, you were insisting on the convergence, or on more convergence between the various levels. Do you mean that this practice, the new planning and the new democratic planning at the local level, was influencing more and more the national level? Or why do you speak about growing convergence between those levels?
Well, one of the things that happened is that with the different social policies and social infrastructures and more formalization of local economies and so forth, you had a mobilization at the local level. And this is generating a new movement, let's say, at the basis of society. And you have these consultation systems. They bring about the necessities at the bottom of society. They bring them up. And on the other hand, we have a long-term movement which is very strong, which is the awakening of the municipalities. The military dictatorship ended in 1985. In 1988, we approved a new constitution. We are coming out of a far-right American-supported military dictatorship, and it was natural that the pendulum went much more to the left. And we managed to put in this constitution municipal autonomy. So they can raise taxes, they have a legislative capacity, yes, and this opened the way for much more autonomous local decisions. We created the CEPAM, the Center for Municipal Planning. We created in São Paulo the IBAM, the Institute for Municipal Administration. In Rio, we created a series of movements. We have very strong institutions like Polis, which works essentially on the support of local development. And Lula asked us to draw up this what we call the national policy of support for local development, which ended up with 89 lines of actions of support for local governments. One thing is coming from the top. The other thing is that we have a very strong movement coming from the bottom, because since they have this legal personality and the capacity to raise taxes and so forth, this has given rise to strong movements where gradually what we call caciques, you know, the local chieftains and the coronéis and all this, you know, the old-time truculent elites that thrived during the military, of course, but existed much earlier, they became much more fragile in this process. So we have a movement which called the São Paulo Network, Nossa São Paulo Network. We managed to create a set of local development indicators, not based on GDP, but based on quality of life. Roughly 100, not roughly, exactly 100 indicators, with variations, of course, according to localities. We started in São Paulo. We have now roughly 300 cities, and these 300 cities represent 80% of the population because they are the big cities. So we are creating the local planning capacity, and the local planning capacity starts with an informed population, because you don't have planning and you can't have the democracy when the population is not informed on their own situations. Typically, we did not have a local information system. We had national statistics, but not local information. And where people can participate, it's at the local level. So unless you disaggregate the statistical system and you change the GDP approach to bring in quality of life indicators, you don't have participation. So this is opening up for a huge set of initiatives. We have now in Brazil a follow-up. We have roughly some 8,000 innovative local initiatives of development. We've given them prizes. There's a whole movement to stimulate this, you see. It comes back to this. We will not have sound national policy systems. We don't make things work at the basis of the pyramid. I see the same for industry, for example. If the industries individually are badly managed, you won't have a good industrial sector. I mean, it's the same thing. You won't have an overall decent management unless the basic blocks that build the country, which are in Brazil 5,565 municipalities, you must put them to work. It's still extremely weak. Yes, we practically have very little management capacities. Things like are elementary and rice and beans, how we call it in Brazil, like aménagement du territoire in France, things of the kind, are still in their first steps in Brazil. So we are building this capacity. It's a race against the time, let's say, because the right is coming very strong, with very strong support from the U.S., not the U.S. Obama, but the Tea Party, multinationals, and all this. They are not just American; they are a worldwide force, of course. And I see always some dark clouds, let's say. I hope it's just pessimism, but the threats are there. I mean, I think everybody's feeling that. Thank you.
I wish also to ask about the same questions as Christian Comelio. First, I wish to thank you very much to give us un peu d'espoir dans ce monde de brut. And with this very impressive process engaged throughout Brazil, but also, I had also the same interrogation of the game between the top and the bottom, and in your answer you focused on the municipal level. You haven't spoken of the federal states composing the Brazilian Federation, and is the global convergence you have evoked also valid between the states, and as you have also pointed out, a very strong movement of opposition, of resistance to this trend, hasn't it some strongholds in the country, places or regions or metropoles where the opposition to this movement is stronger than others?
Well, we have a key issue, on this, which is the fact that in 2010, the Congress managed to change our election law, basically funding the election campaigns. This law, 2010, allows corporations to put up to 2% of their overall capital into a candidate's pocket. This is enormous. This is enormous. They put 2%. In 2010, you must remember, it's a very important worldwide impact decision. The Americans made a free-for-all. The corporations can put what money they want into elections. The election in the US this year will cost $5.2 billion. So actually, you have the traditional right, they vote to the right always. The traditional left, they will vote to the left. And who decides the elections is the shift of the people in the middle who either don't care or don't understand. And if you push lots of TV spots and things like that, and you distribute little goodies and so forth in this middle, you have the election in the pocket. It's hugely complicated, because what is happening is actually that we are purchasing politics. So in our Congress, we have what we call bancadas, benches of groups. So we have the agribusiness group, hugely important in the Senate and the lower Congress. They're linked, of course, to Midland, Monsanto, Bunge, Cargill, the whole Chicago Board of Trade system. It's a whole, you know, the green commodity worldwide commerce. I mean, it's a huge interest group. And they put huge money in the elections. So they have their representatives very strongly. Then we have the automobile political groups. Then we have the big bank political groups. And we have the big constructor political representatives. And we have the big media. I mean, I'm thinking only the five. If you look not for economic groups or corporate representatives, but for citizenship representatives, you have to look very hard. Yes. So you have this overtaking of politics by economic groups, which I think is the key issue, because this weakens the system of whereby, let's say, those federal policies would be able to create a much deeper movement on political transformation at the state levels. We have 26 states, and at the municipal level. This is hugely difficult. We're having an election 10 days from now. The prospects are not very good. They're putting huge money, and as ever, hours and hours every day, radio, TV, everything. They all belong to these four groups, saying that the Worker Party is corrupt, that we invented corruptions and so forth, and it's hugely. It's a struggle, and it's a pity because all these things work, you know. And what is more stupid is that it works for everybody. It works also for the rich. I mean, if you put the country in crisis, it's worse for everybody. But there is a kind of an ideological reaction of this right, you know, that is very worrisome. I consider that rationality in politics plays a small part. Let's say, when we speak politics, it comes down from the brain to the liver, and then you have these green liquids, and it's very bitter, and it's full of hate, and the Homo sapiens has a very small part to play in this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Somebody else? Oh yeah, Vincent, I'm sorry.
I'm here. Like Christian Covillo yesterday, you pointed out the excess power of the big banks, and particularly in the use of public money. Could you just comment, tell us a little more on the way in Brazil you limited the power of banks, if you did so?
Well, I wouldn't say we limited them. We are in the face of, how do you call this game? Bras de fer. It ain't easy, as Bob Dylan says. What we're doing is the following. The former government, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, has instituted a very high level, what you would call the Euribor, LIBOR, etc., etc. What the government pays in taxes to the banks on public bonds. To give you an idea, with low inflation, we had Selic, it is called, the official interest rate. Government pays at 25%. When Lula takes over government, he has to have on public debt to pay 25% to the banks. And this is something. It reached even 48%. So it was a huge transfer of money to the banks. Presently, this interest rate is at 7.5%. Every time we lower 0.5%, there is hysterical shouting in the press that my God, the market will become nervous. As we know, the market is very nervous. I mean, the market usually means a few dozen people. I mean, groups. I mean, they call the market. So this is one set. The second is that we have a cartel of commercial banks in Brazil. I can only understand it as a cartel. To give you an idea, HSBC, for a line of credit in London, you have it at 6.5% a year. The same line of credit in Brazil, in HSBC, is 62%. 62, I'm not joking. Yes. You take Santander, overdraft in Santander, Spain, you have it 0% for 6 months up to 5,000 euros for physical persons. In Brazil, 146%. So they drew up a system, and what the government is now doing, because you cannot just come and decide to wash it, because it's huge movements of monies, and you disorganize the whole economy. So just as we've been gradually pulling down the Selic, we're now pulling down the bank interest, commercial banks' interest rates, which are still huge. I mean, absolutely deadly for any economic activity. It is certainly the major strength that is hampering our development. If you take that for corporations, if you are an enterprise, you want to build a shoe factory or whatever, and you will have to pay 40% a year of interest on this. I mean, you will not have a shoe factory. I mean, this is so simple as that. So we are now in a épreuve de force, in a bras de fer, trying to bring this down, and we're bringing this down because what we're doing is through Caixa Econômica Federal and Banco do Brasil, which are two very big. Happily, they did not privatize everything. So we are being able to use the state banking sector, which is roughly half of the credit in Brazil, to lower gradually the interest rates and to force the banks to get out of the speculative system and to go back to what they should be doing, which is using our savings to fund economic activities. You know, I'm a professor, and you know, professors they like to give homework. Let's say I've been giving quite a few numbers here. I would like to suggest you that you can come on my website. Can we have my website here on you have one text, which is Brazil, an agenda for the decade. 20 pages, it will not kill you. It will give you the basic data on how we've been putting together social policies, economic policy, and macroeconomics to make things work. Well, c'est parfait, c'est parfait. This is the website. You can recognize the moustache here. This is my son's work. You know, we use Sonware. You know, it's a very, very good software. So this is one. Brazil, an agenda for the decade. You go into artigos, which papers, you have it in English, in Spanish, in Portuguese, not in French. If any of you wants to translate one of these papers, I'll be very happy. Many people do this for me. This is all the papers and books are free, online, accessible. You know, we are a worldwide network of professors that have given up the scientific journals, and we are putting things online because we have to change things and we have to work in in a more democratic way. So this is one, Brazilian agenda for the decade. Will be very useful for you. A second one is a paper we drew up together, Ignacio Sachs, Carlos Lopez, and myself. It's called Crisis and Opportunities in Times of Change. It's also a 20-page paper. It is in English. Crisis and Opportunities in Times of Change. We propose 12 lines of change to help to get us out of this of these issues we're facing. I would like you very much to get interested in an essay I put online also. It's in English. It's called Economic Democracy. The general idea is that it's not enough to have politics work through every 2 or 4 years. We put a paper in a box and we say this is democracy. Economics itself has to be democratized. I mean, we have no influence whatsoever on what the banks do, on what, I mean, it's our resources. I mean, how are the things being managed? So this essay, it takes what we call mega trends, macro tendencies. I like the French expression, tendance lourde. It's because there are tendencies or trends which have a very strong inertia, you know. So, for example, we're coming from the traditional physical products economy to the knowledge economy. This changing the rules of the game. Yes, because if I give you an idea, I keep with it. If I give you this, I don't have it. Yes? So, in the knowledge economy, we can create a collaborative system and so forth. For example, in the composition of economic sectors, we have much more social policies as the main sectors. Would remind you that health, 17% of GDP in the US, is the main American economic sector, not the war industry, not the car industry, and so forth. All the sectors of industry altogether, they are less than 10% of workforce in the States. So we are changing what we mean by economy in general, and so forth. So it's a short book on the mega trends that are in a way changing the world. And as the title, Economic Democracy, says, the general idea is that we have to create much more control on what is happening. Yes, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much.